welcome back. We are glad you joined us today as we're continuing our series called Words of Life. And today, Jay, today's word is grace.
All right.
Just to get us started with this, we'll be exploring grace from a biblical perspective. But if we look in the Oxford Dictionary, one of the definitions of grace there goes like this: it's the free and unmerited favor of God as manifested in the salvation of sinners and the bestowal of blessings. That's kind of a mouthful.
Yeah, and so we can just sit there and the little bit more simplified version that Nijay Gupta puts in the book is grace involves God's generous kindness towards sinners, climactically, I love that word, climactically expressed in and through Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's a little easier to grasp. And this series is based on the book 15 New Testament Words of Life by Nijay Gupta, and so we'll be referring to him frequently throughout the chapters are very dense.
Yeah, very
I
much
found,
so.
but it's kind of fun to look at words. I guess the whole point of this series is to explore common words we use as Christians and followers of Jesus that we assume everybody understands, but lots of times everybody nods their head, but they may not have a kind of a grasp of what's happening, or they have a partial grasp when we're trying to.
And I think it's probably a little bit the same with this one, and definitely we've mentioned it even in a few other ones, and I'm sure we'll do the four, is sometimes even when we do have an understanding, it's kind of a limited.
Yeah, or reduced understanding.
Reduced understanding, yeah. and I think that's important as we unpack some of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I was reminded when I started looking at this that a quote from, or actually a story from, I think it's one of Philip Yancey's books, What's So Amazing About Grace, about a story of C.S. Lewis. And it goes a little bit like this. During a British conference on comparative religions, experts from around the world were discussing whether any one belief was unique to the Christian faith. They began eliminating possibilities. Incarnation, other religions had different versions of gods appearing in human form. Resurrection, again, other religions had accounts of return from death. The debate went on for some time until C.S. Lewis wandered into the room. "What's the rumpus about?" he said. And he heard in reply that his colleagues were discussing Christianity's unique contribution among world religions. And in his forthright manner, Lewis responded, "Oh, that's easy. It's grace."
Yeah, I've heard that. That's a good one.
And it's I think what he says makes sense, is that in that most other religions have either rituals or rules or some sort of process to earn enlightenment or to achieve perfection or to go to heaven. And I think an example of that is karma,
Right.
and I think that has Hindu origins.
Yep.
But I know there's been TV shows about it, and it's a common held belief in this sort of the scale of justice kind of thing, where you get what you deserve.
Yeah.
And so there's good on one side and bad on the other. And if you do something bad, you got to do something equally good or something to outweigh the bad. And that determines the outcome.
Yeah. And quite often I think, and I believe it's Malcolm Gladwell who kind of, I'm not sure he coined the term. It's where I heard it from. We call it moral licensing.
Right.
Which is the same idea. And not only is it about outweighing, the good and the bad and wanting to do that, the danger of it, and kind of a little bit we'll talk about when it comes to the grace, is that it's sort of also what we use to, like, it's okay, we've done that thing that's maybe not a great thing.
Yeah.
Look, because the good side is weighing a little heavier. It gives us license.
Yeah. I've done so much good stuff that, hey, I could get away with doing something bad now.
Yeah, and it's taking, again, it's not really karma, but definitely having some connections there and whatnot, and especially with that negative side of, look at all the good I'm doing, I can get away with this, this thing over here.
And I think one of the problems I see with karma too is that our nature is bad. Yeah. So over time, I think we'll never really catch up, and the good will never outweigh the bad. And so as followers of Jesus, we believe that God's grace is part of God's nature. It's a gift.
Yeah.
It's literally getting something you don't deserve, like a second chance. And we're going to explore what exactly that is. Jesus offers himself to to help restore our relationship with God as a gift, and his motivation is love and delight.
Yeah.
So God created us, and so he delights in his creation, and he loves us, and that was his motivation to fix that restored relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, so we do see this, it is depicted in this grace nature.
Yeah.
Is depicted in many places, and really great place to always look at who God is. I mean, other than really when we go to Jesus and look at who God is, but right in Exodus 34:6, where there's actual characteristic traits given to God, and we sometimes I think we can gloss over this, and this is God who is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness.
Yeah, and this is found, I think, in this particular verse, God is actually saying that about himself.
Yeah.
And then it's repeated over and over. It's repeated in the Psalms by David. It's repeated by Moses.
In a lot of places.
It's repeated by all the prophets. Yeah. It's become the very sort of thing that Jews in particular, in this particular case, define God's character by. And, let's look at it a little more closely. God by nature is gracious. Mm-hmm. And I really like the Bible Project has a little video on, they sort of break down this whole sentence into several different videos, but the one on grace is actually quite interesting because it explains sort of the origins of the Hebrew word, which they break into delight and generosity. So God's grace is being generous, and because he takes delight in his creation. So I really like that sort of idea. God views us, that's humans, with delight and is generous towards us in giving us what we don't deserve, which is a restored relationship with him. Mm-hmm. Which leads us to the next point, that grace by definition is undeserved.
Yeah. Yeah, because we are all, impacted by what we call the fall, which is one of the movements in the story of God, which starts with creation, goes to the fall, and redemption and participation and restoration. And that consequence of that is death, and we speak to it one as physical, but also as relational and spiritual, and it's all entangled together. And
I think that's important to distinguish, though. A lot of times we really get hung up on the physical death part because we all die.
Yeah.
So that's sort of, it seems to be inevitable, but what Jesus promises is that there is life beyond that. And I love in Ephesians 2 and 4, the book that Nijay talks about most frequently is the book of Ephesians. Mm-hmm. And he quotes Ephesians 2:4 here, but God is so rich in mercy, and he loved us so much that even though that we were dead because of our sins, he gave us life, that's the undeserved part, when he raised Christ from the dead. And it is only by God's grace that you have been saved.
Hmm. Yeah, so God gives a gift of life.
Yeah, and life was one of our words that we've discussed previously in a podcast, so you can go back and listen to that. So, and again, as you said before, it's restoring the three sort of deaths. All three are restored to life: the physical, the relational, and the spiritual through Jesus.
Yeah, and that act of grace. And so, kind of get to the next point, is that grace is a gift and a responsibility.
Yeah, this took me a little bit by surprise because we always think of grace as you got your second chance, you can do whatever you want with it. But we understand from reading through Ephesians and other writings of Paul that grace is not permission just to continue to do whatever we want without consequences. And in the book, Nijay gives the example from Les Mis, where Jean Valjean, the main character, steals silverware from the bishop after he's offered him a place to sleep for the night. And the police catch him and bring him back to the bishop. And the bishop says that it wasn't stolen, but a gift. And the bishop lets Valjean keep the silverware and even gives him some silver candlesticks to go with it, but makes him promise to use the silver to become an honest man. He says he offers grace to Valjean so that his soul will be withdrawn from darkness and given to God. So again, there's that sort of expectation that I'm giving you another chance, but that I'm even sort of giving you the ability and the power in the case of the Valjean story to get yourself out of being a thief and just living that lifestyle and giving you the ability to actually start over.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, if we're going back to the story of God, using that as an analogy, I think what happens is, we have the movement that's the fall, and we get stuck in that redemption that happens as a result of Jesus and the grace he gives, basically bringing us back. Sort of the restoration is bringing us back to the original intent of who we are. And there's something like with grace, again, like you said, it's not about, we can just go ahead and do whatever we want without consequences. It's the graces we're given, the gift we're given is to start to see ourselves within the eyes of God and his intent for us. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we start to live out in that identity. And obviously, if our identity, we start to really believe that identity, we're not mirrored down by the identity that was never meant to be ours. Yeah, we start to live a life according to that identity, right. And therefore, it is about, just like grace, so I can do whatever I want and without consequence. It is about grace that restores an identity to which then that's how we then live life.
Yeah, and actually, that really sets up the next quote really well. Just this morning, actually, I was sitting at coffee with my wife, Mila, and she was reading me. She subscribes to a journal by Pete Greig of 24/7 Prayer, and she read this to me this morning. This is Pete talking. When I sin, my hope is always that Jesus hasn't noticed, and that if he has, he will at least behave like an English gentleman and brush the whole thing under the carpet. Pete is British. But instead, he comes after me with great tenderness and insistent love. His intention in doing this is never to condemn, but rather to redeem my future and restore our relationship. Mm-hmm. So that speaks exactly to what you were talking about. It isn't about wagging a finger and causing shame. It's about bringing me back to what God intended in the first place, to restore our identity. I really like that.
Well, and that kind of is really some of the things we've been talking about. One as a community, and really trying to understand when we do make those mistakes and that we're calling each other back into that whatever that community identity is. Mm-hmm. We're not trying to cast people out. We're just like, hey, remember, this is who we are. Yeah, and we remind people of who they are to bring them back to that restoration.
Yeah. So restoration and redemption.
Yeah. And it's just very much that's what God is with grace. He's reminding us again who we are, bringing us back in.
And I think Paul in Romans 6 addresses this exact issue. Romans 6:14-16 says, sin is no longer your master if you no longer live under the requirements of the law. Instead, you live under the freedom of God's grace. Well then, since God's grace has set us free from the law, does that mean we can go on sinning? Of course not. Don't you realize that you become the slave of whatever you choose to obey? You can be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living.
And so, Nijay in the book does sum it up this way. Grace is not permission to do anything one wants without consequence. It is a generous act of God to rescue and redeem mortals. But there's more. Those mortals are then called into a new family and a new life. Grace is a gift and a responsibility.
Yeah. And that, again, leads right into the next point that he brings up in the book, that grace is not just a personal thing. It's really a relationship that God is after, and the relationship isn't just between us and God, where we're pushing the world away. We actually have a responsibility to the community of other Jesus followers and the community at large, or humanity. So, so we look at, first of all, our relationship with God. Grace is God's invitation to an enduring and reciprocal relationship with him. I like that is because too often we picture a God, or ancient gods even, where they require something of us and we have to worship them, but we don't ever see or think necessarily first of having a relationship with God.
Yeah, and that is a stark difference even when we compare God, especially that presented within the Bible, to many other depictions of other gods
Yeah.
that would have been happening in the area at the same time, is based on there's a relational understanding
Yeah.
going on there.
And again, Nijay in the book puts it this way. Put simply, believers, that's followers of Jesus, owe their lives and worship to God, but not because it pays God back, but because of that new life found in the relationship with God. So then we look at our relationship with other followers of Jesus. So we are, first of all, recipients of grace ourselves, but then we are also to be grace givers. And we covered this story in one of the parables. We did a series on parables. You can go back and listen to that. But in Matthew 18, there's a story where Peter's asking, how many times do I forgive somebody? And Jesus tells this story about a man. He was one of the servants in the king's court, and he owed the king a large debt, more than he could ever pay back. We're talking millions, possibly even billions of dollars in sort of today's currency. And he, of course, he begs the king to give him grace, and the king does and forgives the entire debt, doesn't have to pay anything back. And the same day, the guy goes to another man in the king's court who owes him a few months' wages. So not exactly $10 or coffee money, a significant amount of money, but in comparison, much smaller than what he owed the king. And he refuses to give grace. So he's received grace, but he refuses to give it. So the other servants report him to the king, and the king calls him on the carpet, and he reinstates the guy's debt and makes him go to prison, sort of the debtor's prison concept, where they have to go to prison and sort of work off the debt until it's paid back. And we know that the second guy, he can work it off to pay it back. The first guy that initially was forgiven, he'll work the rest of his life and not pay it back. So though it's sort of Jesus is obviously using hyperbole here. He's drawing two very stark contrasts of sort of the huge and the not, something that's totally manageable. But in the end of it, he says, this is how God will treat us if we don't forgive and show grace to others. So Nijay in the book refers to Ephesians chapter 4, where Jesus gives different gifts to the community of believers in order for them to benefit each other and to bring support and unity to the community. So again, very interesting, contrasting gifts of the Spirit to fruit of the Spirit. Fruit of the Spirit is developed over time, where gifts of the Spirit are given as a gift. And the purpose of the gift is not for personal gain, but it's to benefit the community of believers. So again, we have this idea that it's our relationship with other followers of Jesus. And the purpose is to build each other up and also to bring unity to the community.
I think that's really important, because I think what you have even sometimes within the different letters Paul would write is sometimes these gifts were sort of used as an ability to platform.
Yeah. I've seen nothing's changed from that.
Yeah, nothing's really changed. But it is instead of like that, this gift is used to build those around. It's used to elevate and just like, and then we start to say, hey, which gift is the one to look towards? Which one's more important? And even I've actually even heard stories where people will do that to the ones mentioned in Ephesians chapter 4, where it's just sort of like trying to figure out even a hierarchical structure.
Yeah, which one's more important?
And it's sort of like no, it's the betterment of unity is we need them all working together, learning from the other, using the other, growing from the other, and that when we see that, it is supporting and building in a unification matter, not a hierarchical sort of, which one is.
Yeah. And you mentioned this in your message in one of our live streams a few weeks ago, where Jesus demonstrated this when he washed the people's feet.
Yeah.
He was trying to eliminate hierarchy.
Yeah.
If I, as your leader, in that culture, a rabbi was an esteemed kind of position, would sort of humble himself to wash people's feet, which was the lowest position in the room kind of thing, as an example of what we as followers of Jesus should do for others in our community.
Yeah, and it kind of just leads into this last point a little bit. When we talk about relationship with people in general, we help spread the word of God's grace gives us an understanding of what hospitality
Yeah.
is so much about the other person.
Yeah. Serving.
Yeah.
Yeah. Too often we got this idea that, we bring them to church, where I think grace giving it goes much beyond that. Not that it's not right to invite someone to church, but it's not. I think it's that thing we talked about before, where okay, if I do that, then I don't have to do something else. And in this case, we really have to show our generosity and hospitality as a way to help spread the news of the kingdom. And the other point is, and I think sometimes this gets lost in our evangelistic efforts, maybe, is that we forget about the marginalized and the poor and vulnerable.
Yeah, justice is a huge importance that, again, we see weaved throughout the Bible, and we can't neglect that.
Can't neglect that. So that's our relationship with people in general. So the three relationships, our relationship with God, our relationship with other followers of Jesus, and our relationship with people in general should be encompassed in the grace we receive and the grace we give out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you once again for joining us as we go through this, just using this book by Nijay Gupta, 15 New Testament Words of Life, and just unpacking some of these words and just really allowing them to hopefully grow in our understanding, refining them, all that sort of stuff, is so that we can truly walk out, hopefully to the best of our ability and our understanding, what we think that God and Jesus want us to know and live as followers of them. So thank you once again. Please like and subscribe so we can do more of this kind of content. Have a great week.